better to die of free candy than to live in bondage.
So I'm a Satanist. I also love Sausage Party. I could say Sausage Party appeals to my twisted sense of humor and leave it at that, but I think it goes deeper. Quick disclaimer before I go any further. Just because I praise Sausage Party from a thematic standpoint doesn't mean I endorse how the animators who worked on the film were treated.
Yikes!
How animation and animators are treated as a whole is a subject worthy of its own video, and the intention of this video isn't to open that can of worms, but instead be an island of positivity in the sea of negativity surrounding Sausage Party. Before I can explain what makes Sausage Party specifically a satanic masterpiece, though, I have to break down what makes the film so good in the first place, starting with the characters, because it doesn't matter how good a plot is if the characters suck. Frank is obviously at first, since he's, the protagonist, and what a good protagonist he is. He's proof that it's entirely possible to create a likable and relatable protagonist without perpetuating a phenomenon which I like to call main character syndrome. When protagonists are written to have generically friendly personalities for the sake of marketability, yet conversely are allowed to get away with all manner of unacceptable behavior simply because they're the protagonist. Frank made a lot of mistakes throughout the course of the film for sure, as we all do, but those mistakes don't make him a bad person. What matters is his heart being in the right place and that he eventually saw the error of his ways. His positive traits and actions such as being brave enough to ask questions, standing up for Barry, treating Brenda as his equal, and his willingness to both listen to Honey Mustard when nobody else would, and put his own life at risk in an attempt to save him, are more than enough to outweigh his flaws, at least in my cookbook. I know something like a guy treating a woman with respect shouldn't be noteworthy, but we live in a society. Speaking of Brenda, I was pleasantly surprised by how much she exceeded my low expectation of just another female character who exists, either to be sexualized, a love interest for a male character, or both. I want to make it very clear that I'm not saying Sausage Party is completely devoid of moments involving Brenda, which would surely count as fan service if the film were an anime, as this definitely is not true. Case in point,
I've never opened up. Look how tight I am.
I'm saying there's more to Brenda than pure sex appeal and her love for Frank. Not only does Brenda refuse to let her love for Frank compromise her own moral code, but this is actually one of the few times where it can be legitimately argued that Brenda's sexuality is empowering rather than objectifying, because her arc is all about overcoming religious trauma, going from this
is what I get for giving in to my disgusting urges. I'm such a whore.
To this.
That together, we can fight these monsters and take control of our own lives!
Yes, our lives and our bodies!
Perhaps some find Brenda to be even more relatable than Frank because religious trauma is so common, particularly among women thanks to things like purity culture and the big three religions, and because not everyone can walk away from everything they've been led to believe is true so readily like Frank did. Despite how great of a character Frank is, he isn't the most obvious choice for a protagonist due to the reasons I mentioned previously. The more obvious choice would be Barry, given that everyone loves an underdog, including me in this case, and that's saying something considering I find the trope to be mostly overrated, as it's hard to get right without relying on the same old overdone cliches. The thing about Barry that makes him stand out from other underdogs is that he doesn't gain any super special powers, nor does he go through any major personality shifts. He's still the same deformed sweetheart of a sausage at the end of the movie as he was at the beginning. What he gained instead was self-esteem and true friendship, using his newfound friends and belief in himself to become the first one, besides Honey Mustard, but I don't think he counts, to escape the Great Beyond in order to save the populace of Shopwells. Apart from his undeniable cuteness, another important factor for animated protagonists, I think Barry is such a popular character because of this relatability, since those who feel like underdogs in real life can't just their way through life like the underdogs in anime can. Going from one cinnamon roll, or should I say bagel, to another. Sammy may not be as complex as the other characters I've talked about so far, but that didn't stop him from taking the spot of my second favorite character in the film. Partially because he's even more of a sweetheart than Barry is, but also because he properly embodies a character trait that I think tends to be poorly executed. The trait in question is pacifism, and yes, I'm well aware my trouble relating to pacifistic characters can simply be explained by being too different from them personally. I have the same problem relating to lawful good characters as a result of my own chaotic neutral alignment. But I can't be the only one who gets frustrated when a character would risk the safety of themselves and or their loved ones for the sake of remaining nonviolent. yet more often than not, pacifistic characters are presented like this. Sammy, on the other hand, subverted my expectations in the best possible way by teaming up with his enemy/rival/boyfriend to attack a being considered a god when his friends were in danger, showing that not resorting to violence at every available opportunity and being a pushover aren't synonymous. I already mentioned that Sammy is my second favorite character, so you're probably wondering who could be better than that. Feel free to guess. It couldn't be anyone other than
Karim Abdul-Lavash!
He's such an and I love it. I kinda doubt Kareem was intentionally written as a tsundere, but he's a great example of how great tsunderes can be when done properly nonetheless. Done properly being the operative phrase here, since although I'm personally fond of tsunderes, not everyone feels the same way given how the trope is often executed. Acts of domestic abuse shouldn't be confused as being acts of love, for instance. There's nothing wrong with tsunderes as a concept. Quite the contrary is true, as they reflect the complexities of real people far better than what a what you see is what you get character ever could, and that's half the reason why they are so popular. The other half is character development. More specifically, how it's impossible by definition to write a tsundere without some kind of character development, and Kareem is no exception. His development may be subtle, which is common among well-written tsunderes, but it's there if you compare how he was at the start of the film versus the end of it. It truly is beautiful to see him fight for his newfound friends and boyfriend without hesitation after initially wanting nothing to do with them. While I'm on the subject of beautiful, Teresa's role may seem minor, but she's no less important. Despite not having as much screen time as most of the other characters that I'll talk about in this video, she still ended up being the empathetic key to resolving the rift between Frank and Brenda. She acknowledged how hurt Brenda was, and didn't try to imply that Frank's insensitivity wasn't uncalled for, but at the same time, reminded Brenda that Frank is flawed and therefore makes mistakes like we all do. She also didn't completely dismiss Frank's point about the lack of control they had in their own lives, perhaps planting the first seeds of doubt in Brenda's mind, even if only subconsciously. The other important aspect of Teresa comes from a representation standpoint. Despite being a queer woman myself, I'm definitely not the sort of person who looks at representation first and foremost when getting into a new piece of media. Because history has shown it can often be a double-edged sword. And I'm strongly of the opinion that the quality of things like narrative and characterization should come before everything else. However, not being as representation obsessed as some others in the queer community doesn't mean that I don't think representation is important, because it is. I just think it's counterproductive to have the most important thing about a character be their gender, race, sexuality, etc. Teresa shows that representation doesn't have to be so over the top to be good. She serves as great representation on two, often poorly handled, fronts which both relate to her dynamic with Brenda. One of these fronts is the refreshing lack of queerbaiting. There is no way to misinterpret or cover up Teresa's attraction to Brenda, nor does this attraction remain as subtextual or hidden. When Teresa does come clean to Brenda about her feelings, Brenda is very respectful and doesn't immediately act like there's something wrong with Teresa, even if her own internalized homophobia prevented her from reciprocating right away. The other front is how their interactions somehow let this movie pass the Bechdel test. I was surprised too. Granted, there aren't any significant female characters in the film besides Teresa and Brenda, but I've come to prefer quality over quantity when it comes to female characters. As much as bad female characters can be a lesson on what not to do, I truly think it's better to have an entirely male or mostly male cast if the writer or writers don't feel like they're capable of making more than a few female characters who are their own people. Last but not least is the film's villain, who is a literal douche, or as some call him, El Duce. Now, anyone who knows my preferences for villains probably expect me to hate a villain like Douche, and that I'll spend the next 20 minutes emphasizing the importance of putting the same amount of thought into writing villains as is put into writing protagonists. While that is a point which far too few writers seem to understand, I'm pleased to report that Douche is actually a great villain. He shows that properly developing a villain doesn't always have to mean giving him a tragic backstory to explain why they are the way they are, though I'm personally quite fond of that tactic. Nor do they have to ultimately be a good person deep down to be interesting. Douche seems like a textbook case of a villain motivated by revenge, but what makes him different is that he's just as affected by the story of the Great Beyond as the rest of the cast is. He didn't decide to go after Frank purely out of rage. He went after him because he felt like Frank made him lose his purpose. The thing about villains is that you don't have to agree with their actions to still see where they're coming from. And this is especially important when it comes to villains created by deep societal issues like religious trauma. As a bonus, his rapid descent into madness was just as entertaining as it was understandable. There are other minor characters that I haven't talked about yet, of course, such as the non-perishables, Druggy, Sally, Gum, etc. But there's nothing notable enough about them that would warrant an in-depth analysis. I do have some thoughts on them, and they're almost all positive. The obvious standouts are the non-perishables, who were up there with the Crystal Gems and the Powerpuff Girls as one of the most iconic trios of our time, but I really liked Gum as well. Honestly, the most negative thing that I have to say about any of the minor characters is that Sally doesn't serve much of a purpose other than to be the perfect partner to Barry, but I find that easy enough to overlook for two reasons. One is Barry deserves all the happiness in the world after everything he endured over the course of the film, while two is that the meeting added some much needed wholesomeness to a very unwholesome section of the movie. Given that there are plenty of characters from series which are much more beloved than Sausage Party that I hate with a burning passion, I'd say it's quite impressive there isn't a character in the film that I really dislike. I briefly alluded to the scene that Sausage Party is infamous for, so I suppose now is a good time to address what seems to be people's biggest problem with the movie before going any further, which is the humor and/or the swearing. Unlike some people, I understand that humor by nature is subjective, which means that neither I nor anyone else can tell you what you find funny. Along the same lines, some people may be uncomfortable with all the swearing in this movie, while others simply don't get what's so funny about animated food dropping F-bombs. I've got two different responses to this. One that seems like a no-brainer, to me at least, and one that's hopefully more nuanced. The former is to watch the clean version if you have such a problem with not safe for work content. People like you are why clean versions of R-rated films are made, after all. If you're still struggling to get through the clean version, that's on you, because I can attest to how sanitized the cleanest version of Sausage Party is compared to the original. The latter response is to consider the idea that the rampant swearing's purpose isn't entirely comedic. This may sound crazy, but let me explain. Studies, which I'm not going to link below because any excuse someone needs to educate themselves is a good one, have shown that swearing builds solidarity and trust. We all know how easy it is for media that involves any sort of social commentary on religion to come across as pretentious and/or preachy. So all the swearing could be a genuine stylistic choice meant to make the characters come across as more authentic, rather than the writers stuffing as much profanity into the film as they could simply for shock value, given the common, and incorrect, assumption that animated movies are for kids. Maybe I'm totally wrong though, and I'm just desensitized to profanity given that I swear like a sailor. I figure why not give this movie the benefit of the doubt since nobody else will. On to the scene that this movie is so infamous for. I'll keep it brief by saying one of its main takeaways is that sex shouldn't be as stigmatized as it is, meaning the people who keep bringing it up are completely missing the point. Now that I've addressed what most people complain about, I can finally talk about the actual plot and overall message of Sausage Party. I'm not sure what the general consensus is on road trip/traveling movies, but judging by how many of my favorite movies, besides this one, would fall under this category, I'm quite partial to them, maybe because the old cliche saying is true. It's about the journey, not the destination. Sausage Party seems like it's just about sentient food making it back to their aisles and learning about each other as well as themselves along the way, but at its core is the relationship between Frank and Brenda. While theirs isn't my favorite relationship in the movie, that's simply a matter of personal preference and not indicative of any writing flaws. I've already explained how their relationship passes the bare minimum of requirements to be considered functional. You know, Frank treating Brenda as his equal and Brenda not being defined by her love for Frank. This strong foundation of mutual respect means that when they do have their argument, you don't have to worry about any sort of disagreement escalating into a domestic abuse situation. Not only that, but their fight is realistic since religion is a very common point of contention for couples, making the unpopular third act breakup/misunderstanding trope come across as much less force than it otherwise would. Going back to the fight itself, I find that the best way to write arguments is to make it so that neither party is completely right or completely wrong. Sausage Party shows why this works, and it all comes down to letting you empathize with both parties. Frank was 100% correct in his assertion that the Great Beyond story is, but he was such an about it that it didn't matter how right he was because nobody wanted to validate him. Brenda, on the other hand, was absolutely justified in feeling hurt by Frank, but her emotions surrounding the situation prevented her from actually listening to what he was saying and thinking about her beliefs from a more rational point of view. As I said earlier, people fight about religion all the time, and in my experience, the fight between Frank and Brenda is on par with what religious discussions between theists and non-theists look like in the real world. That's one of the best things about Sausage Party. Most movies that criticize religion make it seem like atheists can do no wrong, simply because they're right, and that religious people are just crazy for believing what they do. Even if most of them didn't actually choose what religion they follow, but rather were born into it. While Sausage Party calls out self-righteous atheists who end up becoming the very thing they swore to destroy. Of course there's more to Sausage Party than Frank and Brenda, but their relationship is at the core of the film, because it's a microcosm of the environment of Shopwell's, and in turn, our own society's relationship with religion. There's so much internal conflict at Shopwell's, from the rivalry between the kosher foods and the halal foods, to the mutual disdain that the nuts and the fruits have for each other.
We'll fight!
I ain't fighting alongside a bunch of fruits!
Whatever, you nutjob.
Reflecting how every major war in the real world can be tied to religion in some way. Religion doesn't just affect our relationships, it also affects how we see ourselves, which is demonstrated brilliantly in having the villain be after Frank and Brenda, because the story of the Great Beyond led him to feeling like he had no purpose anymore after his nozzle got bent. This is something religious zealots don't like to talk about, how certain beliefs can severely affect people's mental health, which in some cases leads to them doing horrible things to themselves and or others. All of the cast has some degree of religious trauma, though some were worse affected than others, which is a great way of not only connecting Douche to every other product at Shopwell's, but making him seem like less of a heartless monster, and more like someone who's coping with trauma in an extremely unhealthy way. Even the infamous ending has meaning. I completely understand why it makes some feel uncomfortable, but it's hard to argue with the idea that people would have a much easier time loving one another, whether it be metaphorically or in this case literally, if religion was out of the picture. That's not to say everything would be all cupcakes and rainbows without religion, and neither is Sausage Party, which is subtly but smartly shown in how the film ends on a cliffhanger of the main cast walking through a portal into the real world, representing the fact that there will always be challenges to overcome, but it's a lot easier to deal with them together when we aren't being divided by religion. Before I move on though, I want to talk about some general things that deserve a mention and then point out more specific scenes that stood out to me. Probably the most random thing is the transitions between scenes. It's hard to describe why they work so well in words, so I'll have to show you what I mean. I know it seems small, and I'm no screenwriter, but I imagine making cohesive scene transitions is tricky, so credit where credit is due. Given the last of those scenes brilliantly used music to transition, I suppose that should be the next topic. I know others have pointed it out, but I can't make a video singing the praises of Sausage Party without talking about how good it is. I will try to make an observation that I haven't seen anyone else make though, which is how clever it was to have the products of Shopwell sing about the Great Beyond every day, given the significance of music in most religions. The song itself is incredibly catchy, and the fact that it was written by the same guy who wrote the music for some of the most iconic movies of the Disney Renaissance is hysterical. Getting into more specific things, let's first appreciate Douche's mostly unintentional food puns to pad out that food pun counter.
This beef is sick.
Actually, I feel great. Real healthy.
Not you! How you like them apples?
Who, us?
No, not you!
Uh-oh. Light bulb.
Yes?
No, not fucking you, dummy.
Spill the beans!
Eh?
Beans, I swear to fucking God if you don't shut. Okay, so.
Did someone say
The
queso?
fucking stretching, you know it, Queso! I relish the fact that you mustered the strength to catch up to me! Yeah, that's right. Shut your mouths.
Next is the genius move of referencing Saving Private Ryan for the aftermath of the food falling out of the carts. It showed how powerless the food are against humans, while still being funny, albeit in a twisted way. There are two settings that I like to comment on, which are the liquor aisle and the druggie's house. The liquor aisle was really cool and such a great contrast to the rest of Shopwell's. That also served to mirror the separation between religious communities and the party scene in the real world. Plus, Kareem's reaction to it led to one of the most meme-worthy lines in the entire film.
This is a place of of unparalleled sin.
I'm not sure why the druggie's house made a big impression on me though. It just gave off an Island of Misfit Toys vibe, which quickly endeared me to the products there despite their lack of screen time. Lastly, there's the final battle. Just the fact this movie has one, and it's great because final battles make any movie that much more epic. It's one of the many reasons why Battle of the Smithsonian is my favorite installment in the Night at the Museum series. Anyway,
Moving on.
what does all this have to do with Satanism? And how could something having satanic values ever be considered a good thing, you ask? Well, before explaining how Sausage Party can be linked to Satanism, I have to separate the crap ton of misinformation about Satanism from what Satanists actually believe. Because there's a good chance that the image you have in your mind of what a Satanist looks like is far from accurate. I do need to preface this part of the video by saying I'm what religious folks would call a non-denominational Satanist, meaning that I don't subscribe to any particular set of satanic beliefs. So I'll be explaining what Satanism is as a general concept, and exploring how Sausage Party embodies it, rather than connecting the film to a specific satanic doctrine or belief. I'm also not going to bother covering what you may or may not currently believe about Satanism, because the last thing those ideas need is further circulation. Plus, if I were to get into detail about everything Satanists have been accused of believing/doing, I'd only be increasing the already high chance of this video being demonetized. Satanism, for the most part, is an atheistic religion. Rather than worshipping a literal devil, Satan is used as a symbol of rebellion against authority, and promotion of an individual's personal liberty as the most important thing in life. This has led to a chicken and egg sort of scenario, where people think there's something wrong with Satanism by nature, because many of those that society labels as deviants identify as such, when in reality, these people are naturally drawn to Satanism because of how much more accepting it is compared to pretty much all other religions. The term safe space has definitely been hijacked in recent years, but satanic circles can really function that way for sexual/gender minorities and survivors of religious trauma. Obviously, most of these survivors are only comfortable identifying as simply atheists, for fear of being cast further out from society, but the main difference between atheism and Satanism is that atheism just identifies what you aren't, while Satanism identifies what you are. Sure enough, the diverse sort of people that gravitate towards Satanism are well represented in Sausage Party. There's the non-perishables polyamorous relationship, Sammy and Kareem aka DoTP, and the dynamic between Brenda and Teresa, which adds up to a wide array of sexual minorities. And I already mentioned how the whole cast, including the villain, are survivors of religious trauma. It's genuinely baffling to me how people complain so much about the lack of good queer representation in media, despite Sausage Party existing since 2016, and having some of the best queer representation that I've seen in recent Western media. I can at least somewhat get complaints about the scene that shall not be named in general political incorrectness, but none of the characters involved in the queer relationships featured are defined primarily by their sexuality, which is an important step forward for queer representation as a whole. Sausage Party's satanic parallels don't just stop at that though. The theme of discovering self-worth and personal power, shown through the character arcs of Brenda and Barry, mirrors how Satanists worship themselves, instead of some nebulous higher power. Satanism and Sausage Party have also garnered controversy over things that shouldn't at all be considered offensive. With Satanism, it's regarding protests in favor of maintaining the separation of church and state, while Sausage Party's mere existence as an animated film proves that animation isn't something just for kids. The importance and truth of both these things should be obvious, but to put it bluntly, people are stupid. Given all this, you can probably start to see why Sausage Party spoke to my Satanist self on such a deep level. I'm 99.9% sure that the writers didn't intend to make Sausage Party come across as a satanic parable, which is why I'm thankful that there's no such thing as a single correct way of interpreting a piece of media. Look, I know that some just clicked on this video to leave a hate comment, and others will claim that I made this video for the sake of converting people into Satanists. Never mind that doing such a thing not only goes against the dogma of Satanism, but my own personal beliefs as well. There's a difference between being educated about something like religion and actually believing it. And wisdom shows that the more educated someone is on religion, the more likely they are to not be religious. I made this video because I have no reason to be ashamed of my satanic beliefs, and wanted to give people a new perspective on a movie that I hold dear through the lens of those beliefs. After all, one of the most important aspects of this channel is giving a voice to those with unpopular opinions. It doesn't matter how hated a piece of media is. odds are that it's still someone's favorite, but they just don't feel comfortable saying so because of toxic groupthink. My hope is that even if you leave this video still disliking Sausage Party for whatever reason, you at least learned a little something about a highly demonized, pun absolutely intended, religion. If this video did speak to you, let me know in what way in the comments down below. Hit that thumbs up button if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more content like this.